The Annals of Earth issue that John and Nancy brought up includes an article by John on brown water and ocean restoration, which is really excellent, and I urge you to pick that up. I publish a weekly that looks at what's happening at the colleges and universities and in the community about energy and other events, a lot of which is about climate change. Those of us who live in the Cambridge and Boston area have an incredible opportunity to look at everything that's happening within the academic and the community sphere of what's going on. No one person can go to everything just on climate change that's happening every day. And I urge you to look at my website, hubevents.blogspot.com, if you're here. A woman asked about, Charles Mann was mentioned, 1493. He delivered a lecture at Tufts a month, 6 weeks ago, and Tufts records those things, right? So there's so much information here, and we have to mine that the same way, right, that we mine for materials or harvest grain. All of this intellectual information is floating back and forth. Almost none of the stuff that we're talking about here is happening at the colleges and universities. They're not talking about this kind of biological and ecological solutions. They're still talking about mechanistic solutions. So I urge you to get involved in what's happening with the colleges and universities and in the communities. And my little piece of that is to list that every week and see what happens. And please take advantage of it. Look at it if it's of interest to you. My email is there. Get in contact with me. It's free, and it's a great resource, not because I do it, but because of all of the stuff that's happening every day. The best people in the world pass through here because we're an academic capital, and we should take advantage of it. Hub events, hubevents.blogspot.com.
My question is for John. So first and foremost, your boats look incredibly cool, and I love that you're using solar and wind energy to power them. A few things came into mind as you were talking about them. One, I spent a lot of my time looking into the solar industry, and one question that kind of came up in my mind is, first and foremost, do you plan on using, more specifically, the Pelicano at night? Because when you have the sails up and they're covering your solar panels, I worry that you might not be utilizing as much energy. So, like, how would you be able to power your boat if your panels are not getting as much energy from the sun because you're sailing, which is still powering the boat, but when there's no wind and you need to move?
Well, first of all, there in the Pelicano, there will be a battery system. And secondly, there also will be probably a log over the side regenerating some water from the forward motion. It reduces the effectiveness of the vessel, but not that much. There's a whole lot of ways of really skinning that cat. The Pelicano was designed for the Caribbean, but now we're working on what such a vessel would look like in New England, say, working anywhere from Long Island to Nova Scotia. And what that will actually shake out to look like, not sure, but we hope to know by about February or March. Yeah.
Maybe.
Just a quick question to Peter. Was the water, the second ocean, under the ocean, is that fresh? Is the water
Fresh or
under the
salt?
ocean fresh or salt?
That's a great question. Is the water under the ocean fresh or salt? The answer is that it is primarily salt. There are reservoirs of more fresh water or fresher water than sort of typical salinity in some of these. This happens when you basically get boiling, and we'll call it phase separation. So you make steam and then it condenses. But that is, it is primarily salt. And I don't know if the motivation of the question was thinking about freshwater or just sort of wanting to know for the sake of knowing.
Well, if it's fresh water, it's going to have a different value for people, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, I see, okay, I see what you're getting. Yeah, I would not call it fresh or potable in that sense of the word.
Is it usable in terms of industry?
Good question. Is that water in the aquifer usable in terms of industry? Let me answer that by saying that the water that circulates through there is chemically altered from the bottom water so that it does have a lot of hydrogen and hydrogen sulfide and a lot of compounds that we call chemically reduced. Uh, that has some value. It does produce those mineral deposits and the like. But I want to talk about heat for a second. Well, here's an interesting idea. And that is, if we look at the amount of heat that moves out of hydrothermal systems through these hydrothermal vents, it is pretty impressive. And there are technologies to actually generate electricity from hydrothermal vents. There are 2 companies that I know of that are pursuing this. The extent to which that is economically relevant on land is unclear to me. But one thing I will note is that the value of electricity in the ocean is actually markedly different than the value of electricity on land. So there are a few of us, who, myself included, who work on technologies figuring out how do we generate electricity in situ. There's some reasons to do this. One is that if you can actually generate electricity on the seafloor, you can use that electricity to do work. And Tom will tell you later about different ways that you can use these to produce scaffolds for other organisms. You can do things like improve monitoring of offshore processes like oil drilling. My lab has worked on a technology called microbial fuel cells for a while. And what we're able to do is generate pretty modest amounts of power, but it's power nonetheless, from microbes just doing their thing. And we have, through working with a company, we're trying to develop a technology to approach oil and gas and use these for more robust environmental monitoring. Right now, oil and gas pushes back on Congress when it comes to monitoring legislation because they say, well, you know, the economics aren't there, we have to dive a submarine and replace batteries, and there's a lot of different arguments. But I think having an independent, kind of energy neutral way of keeping track of that adds value. And one last thing, the Deepwater Horizon, there are a number of different systems that are blowout preventers, right, that to stop what happened from happening, and one of them failed because its batteries weren't charged. So it's something to keep in mind. That's a bit different than what you were asking, but I think it is interesting to think of how do we capitalize off natural processes in a sustainable manner.
And I have one more question regarding the machine that you were talking about. How much does that cost?
Which machine?
Whatever that gigantic machine was underwater. They
Oh,
were using.
yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the cost of the mining equipment.
Yeah.
I don't know. What I will tell you is that there are 2 companies that really that are kind of pushing this technology forward. Their investors have sort of paid in full for the machine. The issue at this point, if there is an issue that will prohibit this from going, is that there's uncertainty by the International Seabed Authority and some of the nations as to what the environmental impact of this will actually be. But I will say a knee-jerk reaction for most government leaders will be to say, oh, well, this is better than a big strip mine or a pit mine on land. So sort of, it's been starting and stopping, but I do see it happening.
Yeah, George, are you familiar with some of the hydrothermal vents in Iceland where they're close to glaciers and things like that, are actually fresh water inside coming out to salt water outside? And the theory is that that's where, you know, there's a proton gradient. The acidities are different inside and outside originally back when life first began. And I just wondered if you'd studied any about how life started in hydrothermal vents, had thought about that at all. So, is that a good idea, or?
To whom are you addressing that?
You.
Oh, I just said George. Oh, okay, me, I'm sorry, it's okay. Oh, yeah, so life at hydrothermal vents. I think that there is a lot of debate about where life evolved. I think there is consensus that it's most likely to have evolved somewhere where you have, they call it an energy gradient, right? And by analogy, if you're trying to do work, I'm just going to zoom out here and talk about humankind, right? If you're trying to do work, you need to be able to harness energy from somewhere. So let's go back to paddle wheels, right? Think about an old grist mill taking advantage of the flow of water down a river. in a very real way, at the biochemical level, you actually need a flow of electrons to do work. And you can use that flow of electrons from something that has a lot of electrons to something that wants a lot of electrons. You can harness that energy to do work. So if an organism is, if we're talking about the evolution of organisms, it's likely to have occurred somewhere where those kinds of gradients exist. It used to be thought that that was at high temperature hydrothermal vents. Our thinking now is that there are other places where the conditions are more moderate. Right? Vents are they're pretty gnarly places, right? The water temperature is 350 Celsius. It's like your oven in self-clean mode, right? So it's sort of it's harder to imagine that. But these warmer water systems are definitely on our radar for that.
I have two questions, one for Peter, one for John. Peter, what is your opinion of manganese nodule mining on the seafloor? And John, could you pitch El Pelicano as a matter of national security for the $25 million?
Do you want to take it away first?
I'll take it first. Damn. Then just think of who would I have to start dealing with. I don't know. Just a few years back, I was working with the very well-known naval architect. Unfortunately, he's now no longer with us, Dick Newick. We were working in South America, in Guyana, and we had a coastal research vessel that we had built in New England that sailed down there, and we're working with the fishermen. And Dick proposed to the Minister of Defense that he could design and build a fossil fuel independent, because their currency was really crappy then, they couldn't buy stuff. And 2 days later, the Canadian ambassador called us in and said, you have to leave this country by dusk tonight because there's a contract out on you. So we were solving a military problem. Yep, we sure were. Ours. In other words, unintended consequences. Good ideas sometimes go in wrong directions. I don't know. I think my fantasy would be to just bring good wines from the Mediterranean to New England and sell them great seafood, including seaweeds back.
Maybe you can have grapevines on your catamaran.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Manganese nodules, terrible idea. Do you want to hear more, or can we leave it a terrible idea? Okay. So if I put I'll just call it my objective hat on, right? So I'll take my scientist hat off, and someone will ask me about what are the economics of this? Well, manganese nodules take an incredibly long time to form. They will be depleted in a very short while, and thus I think it's foolish. Even if you tried to make the case that it were a pure or you are going to invest a lot of money and do a lot of damage because they exist on these very stable abyssal plains, you're going to do a lot of harm for very little benefit in the short term or in the long term.
Thanks.
Peter, can you explain what a can-filled ocean is? Are we headed towards one? What do we need to do to not get to one?
Yeah, so throughout Earth's history, our ocean has had different compositions, and sometimes it's been iron-rich, and other times it has been sulfur-rich, and these coincide with different periods in Earth history where different geological, geochemical, and biological processes were taking place. Are we headed there? I'm not convinced we're headed there. And it is a really, we live in a very oxygen-rich world, right? And that means that I see it unlikely that the entire ocean is going to become anoxic. That said, let's entertain that scenario. What happens if we shut down the Gulf Stream? part of what the Gulf Stream does is it takes warm waters and moves them off of Greenland and Iceland, where they become cold and they sink. And then they circulate through the deep ocean, right? And that's part of the so-called global conveyor belt of ocean circulation. If you brought ocean circulation to a halt, the question then becomes, how is oxygen replenished in the deep sea? And then the follow-on question is, if it's not, how long do we have to go before that oxygen is used and makes the deep ocean hypoxic? I think that those are very difficult scenarios to even enter, to even sort of guesstimate on how likely they are. But I will say this, that as we think about these changes in our climate, like so many things in our biosphere, they're all interconnected, and we see these issues pop up that we otherwise may not have considered. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it did.
We'll have one final question from one of the symbiosis team.
I was wondering if you knew the current effects of ocean acidification on the deep sea corals?
That's a great question. The question was the current effects of ocean acidification on the deep sea corals. A number of groups around the world are studying deep sea corals to look at that. And what they are finding is that some deep sea corals are much less sensitive to changes in pH, and that there are others that are. We don't really understand the physiological basis for that. Now, that means that some of the deep sea corals that are sensitive, we are starting to see impacts, especially in areas like the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of people are excited by the fact that some corals are more resilient and say, well, let's just sort of engineer, not forget engineering, let's encourage those corals. Let's see if we can try to breed those corals and replace the other more sensitive corals. I think that unfortunately, it's not all corals are equal, right? They're not all created equal, if you will. And so just think they're interchangeable is a little naive at this point. And that's where the conversation's at.